All right, well, tonight as we resume our study on a history of the Baptists and the Bible they preserve, we are with part number 4, which is entitled The Missionary Zeal of the Early Baptists. And I'm going to begin by reading a passage from the Gospel of Luke, Luke 22, beginning in verse number 35. Jesus is talking to the disciples, and here's what he asks them. He said unto them, When I sent you without purse and without scrip and shoes, lacked ye anything? And they said, Nothing. Then said he unto them, But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say unto you that this that is written must be accomplished in me. And he was reckoned among the transgressors, for the things concerning me have an end. So Jesus told the disciples, if you don't have a sword, go and buy one. In our study this evening on Baptist history, we're going to see yet another period of Baptist history where the true New Testament churches throughout the ancient world were under persecution, not only by the government, but also by the Roman Catholic Church. You will hear tonight some of the stories of Christians that were martyred for the faith by others pretending to be Christians themselves. And so tonight we'll begin part number 4, the missionary zeal of the early Baptist. A new name for old churches. As we've talked about before, one of the attacks of the Catholic Church on true New Testament churches of every generation has been to call them by names based on the names of some of their new pastors in each generation, trying to make true New Testament Bible-believing churches appear to just be something new that has come along, when in fact it's a lineage dating all the way back to the apostles of one generation of church after another that has maintained the purity of doctrine and practice from the New Testament. These are not new churches teaching some new thing. They're just the descendants of those that had formerly been doing the same for hundreds of years. And so tonight we're into the period of time known as the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. According to the Roman Church, a new sect, S-E-C-T, sprang up in the eastern part of the old Roman Empire. And by this time, it's no longer known as the Roman Empire, which is considered to have collapsed in AD 476 with the fall of Rome. And everything moved east to the new capital of Constantinople, which was named after Emperor Constantine, by Emperor Constantine, no less. It was the old city of Byzantium of the Greeks. And so for that reason, the Eastern Roman Empire, which continued to exist even after the fall of Rome, it is known as the Byzantine Empire. So according to the Roman Church, a new sect sprang up in the Byzantine Empire around the year AD 660 in the region of Armenia. And if you see on the map up here, this is Turkey, and Armenia is actually that area just north of Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea. It's labeled Armenia on the map, actually down into Turkey, but Armenia proper is to the north of that in the area that is shaded. But this is the area where these supposedly new churches sprang up, when in reality you and I know they weren't new churches at all. There may have been new churches being planted, but they believed the same doctrines, believed the same teachings as the Baptist churches of the centuries all the way up to AD 660. Now, the Catholic Church claims that this was a new movement that quickly spread from Armenia into Phrygia and then into Europe. But the reality is that the Catholic Church simply began associating all of the former Montanist, Novatian, and Donatist churches with this new movement. So anybody that believed what a Baptist church believes today, the Catholic Church was just lumping them all together and calling them by this new name that we're about to see. But they're the same churches we've seen before, that at first the Catholics called Montanists, then they called them Donatists, and it's the same churches that believe the same thing that Baptist churches today believe. This new movement was actually nothing new at all. It was just the continuation of the same New Testament churches which had continued to exist all along, despite persecution by Rome, the Roman Church, and now the Mohammedans. If you'll remember, it was around AD 632 that Muhammad had his Hajj, his special holy trip, and then he and his followers began declaring war on everybody they came across. First, they conquered all of the peninsula of Arabia, and then they began to spread from there. They spread across North Africa. Then they spread northward up into the area that is the land of Palestine or Israel, and then all the way up even into the area around Turkey that we know today as the country of Turkey. And so these early Christians around AD 660, they not only have to contend with persecution by the Roman government of the Byzantine Empire, but also being persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church, which is working in cahoots, in conjunction with the government of the Byzantine Empire to persecute them. And then now they're having to also contend with the Mohammedans, the Muslims, who are murdering anyone who doesn't convert to Islam. Now, here's the Catholic version of the story of this new, quote-unquote, group of churches. The Catholic version of the origin of this supposedly new movement was that a young man who was a Manichee was given a copy of the Gospels and the epistles of Paul from the New Testament by a Christian who is fleeing captivity from the Mohammedans or the Muslims. Now, a Manichee is someone who is a follower of the prophet Manes, M-A-N-E-S or M-A-N-I. Sometimes you'll see it spelled. He was someone who basically started his own religion. And this fellow that started his own religion, he combined aspects of Zoroastrian dualism, the yin and yang type thing we see, as well as Buddhism and Gnostic Christianity. He was not a Christian in any sense of the word. He was a dualist. He believed there were two forces at work against one another, good and evil, and all of his religion was centered upon that, even though he pulled some aspects of different religions, including so-called Christianity, into his new religion. So this fella was supposedly a follower of this false prophet, Mani, and he supposedly was given a copy of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and a copy of Paul's epistles. And after reading them, he is supposed to have converted to Christianity and somehow mixed those Christian philosophies in with his Manichaeism and started proselytizing in the area of Armenia that you saw on the map. And voila, he started having disciples left and right and starting churches of their own that were not Christian churches. They were this mixture, this Manichaeism mixed with Christianity. Now this is the Catholic version. The fellow's name, according to the Catholics, was Paul. This is a young man named Paul. Not the Apostle Paul, but someone named Paul. And they claim that all of the churches that were started based on his mixture of Manichaeism and Christianity became known after him as Paulician churches. Well, the reality is this is just the Catholic Church doing the same thing we've seen them do over and over again, where they attempt to affix the name of Bible-believing churches to the name of a prominent pastor in order to make it look like this is just a cult following of some man claiming to have special revelations from God. The historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote the famous history on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, says this of the Paulicians. The Paulicians sincerely condemned the memory and the opinions of the Manichaean sect. and complained of the injustice which impressed that invidious name on the simple votaries of St. Paul and of Christ. In other words, the noted historian Edward Gibbon says the Paulicians disassociated themselves from any notion that they were Manichees or followers of somebody who was a Manichee. They said, we are simply followers of Jesus Christ and the Apostle Paul. And of course, that's what we are today as well. But that's the Catholic version of the story. But the reality is, the Paulicians were not named after this fellow who was supposedly a Manichee. These churches were named after the Paul you and I are familiar with, the Apostle Paul, who wrote the majority of the books of the New Testament. While the Roman Catholic Church would like everyone in the past as well as today to believe that the Paulician churches were heretic Manichaeans following some fellow named Paul from Armenia, history tells a different story. The Paulician churches were in fact the descendants of those that were formerly called Novatians, Montanists, and Donatists by their Catholic enemies. In his famous work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that same historian we just referenced, Edward Gibbon, who, by the way, was not a Bible-believing Baptist, he's just a secular historian, but he wrote this also about the Paulicians. The name of the Paulicians is derived by their enemies from some unknown and domestic teacher, that is, some guy named Paul from Armenia. But I am confident that they gloried in their affinity to the apostles to the Gentiles. In the Gospels and the epistles of St. Paul, his faithful follower investigated the creed of primitive Christianity. And whatever may be the success, a Protestant reader will applaud the spirit of the inquiry. He's acknowledging that the Paulicians themselves did not consider themselves the followers of Paul from Armenia, but of Paul the Apostle in the New Testament. The Paulician churches received the name that they did, not really because they were disciples of some obscure peddler of Manichee teachings named Paul, but because of the emphasis that they placed upon the writings of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. Because Paul in the New Testament refers to himself as the apostle to whom the mystery of the church was revealed and the apostle to the Gentiles. His epistles, that is the Pauline epistles, form what is essentially the constitution and bylaws for every New Testament church from his day to ours. The importance placed upon Paul's epistles and their strict adherence to them is what caused these churches to be branded by their enemies as Paulicians. So you can take the Catholic version of where their name came from and crumple it up, throw it in the waste paper basket. The real reason they were known as Paulicians is because they were tenaciously following the writings of the Apostle Paul. And in that respect, Baptist churches today are Paulician churches, because we understand that even though we love and respect the Gospels, which tell us about the life of Christ in the New Testament, it is the Apostle Paul that the Lord gave the recipe, the manual, if you would, for the New Testament church. And we follow the writings of the Apostle Paul in our Baptist churches today. So why were they called Paulicians? It had nothing to do with a fellow named Paul from Armenia. It's because they followed the writings of the Apostle Paul. So what did these churches believe? Well, we really have very little remaining from their actual writings, because every time the Catholic churches found some of their writings or their Bibles, that's right, they cast them into the fire and burned them.
Along with the believers.
Along with the believers themselves. So what we know about their beliefs come from their Catholic accusers, but even just looking at what the Catholic accusers say they believed, they sound a lot like Baptists to me. We'll just briefly look at the list. Number one, they endeavored to give the Scriptures to everybody. Number two, they made no distinction between the clergy and the laity. Number three, in other words, they didn't have priests and popes. Number three, they read the Scriptures publicly around other people. Number 4, they were faithful in marriage, which is still good for people to follow today. Number 5, they drank no wine, that is alcoholic wine. Number 6, they emphasized the priesthood of the believer, which is one of the doctrines we Baptists still believe today. They had no councils, synods, nor associations, but were independent, autonomous churches. They rejected the belief in the perpetual virginity of Mary. They often designated the names of their local churches after New Testament names such as Ephesus, Colossae, Philippi, etc. By the way, I know a few Baptist churches named after those things today in our own area. They disbelieved in the material presence of the Lord's body and blood in communion. Now, this is that Catholic belief we've talked about before, where the Catholics believe in transubstantiation, that the wafer and the wine literally turn into the body and blood of Jesus as the parishioner consumes it during Mass. These Paulicians refuted that. They did not believe in that. They believed the same thing Baptist churches today believes. A Catholic historian states that they agreed but little with the Manichaeans. They gave the scriptures to all, even women, and treated the worship of crosses, images, relics, and Mary with contempt. In other words, they did not venerate crosses or relics. They didn't pray to Mary, worship Mary. They believed just like Baptist churches believe today. The Paulicians were the Baptist churches of their day. So here comes the persecution. Quoting an earlier historian, the famous Baptist historian Thomas Armitage of the 19th century wrote this of the Paulicians. Virtually all that remains of the creed of this faithful people is the self-condemning testimony of their persecutors from the Church of Rome, because the Roman emperors, at the behest of the Roman bishops, committed their books to the flames. And if any person be found to have secreted them or hidden them, he was to be put to death and his goods confiscated. From AD 832 to 846, 14 years, in that short 14 years, the Byzantine Empress Theodora had more than 100,000 Paulicians put to death for their quote-unquote heresy against the Catholic Church. That means in 14 years, she had 100,000 Baptists put to death for the same thing you believe today. For more than 100 years, the Paulicians took up arms against the state in self-defense in the Byzantine Empire. They defended themselves against attack for more than 100 years. In AD 973, the Paulicians in the empire were transported en masse to Bulgaria, northward, and promised religious liberty. They were used as a human shield to protect the capital of Constantinople, or Byzantium, from the hordes of invading barbarians to the north. In spite of the constant dangers, the number of Paulicians exploded in Bulgaria when they were given even nominal religious liberty. So after being persecuted for over 100 years, fighting for their lives just to exist, the government of the Byzantine Empire said, okay, we're going to make a deal with you. You're going to get religious liberty like you want, to worship how you want, but we're going to move all of you across the Dardanelles into Europe, into what we would call modern-day Bulgaria. We're going to move all of you up there. You can believe how you want to believe, live how you want to live. We're going to put you up there and give you religious liberty. The reality is the government was sending them up there to use them as a human shield, a buffer zone from the invading hordes that were invading the Byzantine Empire from Asia, coming down from the north through the Balkans and attacking the city of Constantinople. They were not in any way interested in giving these people religious liberty. And the reality is, even though they were promised religious liberty, they were still persecuted even after getting to Bulgaria. But they were so far removed from Constantinople, the capital, they had at least some religious liberty just because there wasn't anyone keeping an eye on them as closely in Bulgaria. So when they get to Bulgaria and they actually are able to practice their religion and start churches without persecution as much, their churches began to grow. And that's what happened. Their population, their numbers began to explode once they got to a place where they weren't under persecution. From there, they begin to spread out. Despite the persecution by the state and the Roman Church, Paulician churches sprang up throughout much of Europe from the 9th to the 14th century. So that would be from the 800s to the end of the 1300s. Some of the different names given to the Paulicians in different places are as follows. The Bogomils, that's the name that was given to them when they were in Bulgaria that you see on the map in Europe, right across from Turkey. The Paulicians who were transported to Bulgaria grew in number and were known by the name of Bogomils, which means the dearly beloved of God. Some of them moved to southern France, which at that time was still known as Gaul, G-A-U-L. The Paulician missionaries traveled over there, established churches, and they came to be known by the Catholics as the Albigenses, named after one of the towns where they were so numerous there. But they continued to refer to themselves by a different name. The name they preferred was the Cathari, or the Cathars. That means the pure. That is, those who tried to maintain the purity of the doctrine. Now, we'll talk more about them in just a few minutes. The Catholic Church tried to say that the Cathari were Manichaeans, dualists. Not so whatsoever, but we'll see that in just a few minutes. Then some of them moved looking for safety up to the mountains around northern Italy and Switzerland to the north of that in the Alps. And there in the Alps, they joined together with other Baptists that had been there all the way back to the 3rd century when some of the Novatians moved up to Milan and then into the Alp mountains. And they are the ones who were called the people of the valleys, the Valdenses, which also is pronounced Waldenses, and they joined themselves to the Waldenses. So you have some of the Paulicians moved into Bulgaria, then into the Alps, some into southern France, some up into Germany, and some, after making their way to the northern part of France, even crossed the English Channel, and there were Paulicians in southern England up to the time of John Wycliffe, who will be the first to translate the entire Bible into English for the English-speaking people. You can read whatever works you want to read on John Wycliffe, and you'll never find a secular book, or probably not even a religious history book, giving the Paulicians credit for their influence on John Wycliffe. But everywhere the Paulicians went, just like the Baptists before them, they translated the Scriptures into the common languages of the people. Had Wycliffe ever seen a Paulician Bible? We don't know that. We have no written records of that. But we know there were Paulicians in southern England in his day. There's no way he could have not known who the Paulicians were, what they believed, because they were under the condemnation of the Catholic Church. And before he separated from the Catholic Church, he was part of the Catholic Church. So he undoubtedly knew who they were, what they believed, and that they were known for translating the Bible into the common languages of the people. You'll not find a history book that will give the Paulicians any credit for John Wycliffe's English Bible, but I assure you they were somewhat responsible for it nevertheless. Here's a map again that shows their path. And again, we talked about the first night of Baptist history. The gospel continued from its very beginnings in Jerusalem to move northward and westward, and we continue to see that even in the path of the Paulicians as they traveled. They had a love for the Word of God. The preacher here at Pinnacle Baptist Church preached a message this morning on the fact that Baptists are supposed to be the people of the book. We're supposed to love the Word of God. Well, the Paulicians did. Their Catholic enemies reported that the Paulicians read the Scriptures publicly and that they translated the Scriptures into the common languages of the people wherever they moved. They knew the Bible well and could quote it. They were also active soul winners. Their evangelist, a fellow named Sergius, wrote that he was converted to Christ after a woman who was a Paulician gave him the gospel orally. Now, you will not find any instance of women being allowed to have a copy of the Scriptures or do anything in the Catholic Church in any of the early centuries of the Catholic Church. But here is a Baptist lady who was saved, and she was doing what Baptists are always supposed to be doing. She was telling whoever she ran into about Jesus, and she ended up leading this heathen to the Lord. After he got saved, he became a Paulician preacher himself. In his polemic work against the quote-unquote heresy of the Paulicians, the Byzantine monk Paulus Siculus of the 7th century said this: "Both priests and people are in duty bound to the constant perusal of the gospel." In other words, they all believe it is their responsibility to read the Bible for themselves. Their quote-unquote books were committed to the flames whenever their persecutors discovered them. These books not only included Bibles, but Bibles translated into the common vernacular of the people, and I'm sure also included other books about what they believed as well. But not just any Bible would do. The Bibles of the Paulicians were notably different than the Bibles in the Catholic Church, even in their own day. Now, what we're about to see and read for ourselves from history would make you think these were fundamental independent Baptists of today, but we're talking about Baptists of the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries who realized in their own day that the Catholic Bibles had become corrupted intentionally, and they refused to use Catholic Bibles, and they trusted those that had been preserved by their own churches throughout the centuries. Now, this is important because it's still an issue today, and it's important that we understand that Baptists, even 1,000 years ago and more, realized that the enemy had intentionally corrupted the Word of God and had a totally different line of Bibles than the ones Baptists were using even then. Their Bibles were not the same as those of the Catholic Church. Besides the fact that the Paulician Bibles were often translated into the common languages, their Bibles were distinctively different in text, that is, in the content, than those of the Roman Catholics of their day. The Baptist historian of the 19th century, Faber, says this, quote, "Nor did they only possess it," that is the New Testament, "thus far numerically complete. What is absolutely and inherently fatal to the malignant calumny of their pretended Manichaeism, they possessed it likewise, as their hostile historian himself admits, free from all interpolation and erasure and corruption," in the precise words of the genuine copies. What he's saying is that the Catholics accused them of being Manichaees, dualists, but in reality, these people held tenaciously to the New Testament. And anything that wasn't in the New Testament, they threw it out. It wasn't a part of what they believed. He again says, quote, "Nor did they derive their scheme of doctrine from a mutilated or interpolated or corrupted New Testament. The ancient Gnostics and Marcionites and Manichaeans, conscious that their own allied systems and the genuine gospel could not subsist together, were notorious for their unprincipled erasures and adulterations. What he is saying is that the Paulicians acknowledged that the Catholics and the Bibles they were using had all been corrupted. They had taken out the things they didn't want, added the things in they wanted, changed the things that were still there. But the Paulicians had remained true to an exact word-for-word copy from the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts they had inherited from the Baptist churches before them. These Anabaptist churches, the Paulicians, were different than the Catholic Church. And so too were their Bibles different than Catholic Bibles. These were New Testament churches, and their Bibles were the preserved New Testament text from the days of the apostles. The Paulician manuscripts were those that were copied and recopied from the original autographs that dated all the way back to the apostles. No one has any originals today. No one had any originals in the 8th, 9th, or 10th century. What they had were copies. But the copies of the Paulicians were the ones that had been copied all the way back to those churches started by the Apostle Paul in the beginning. The Paulician manuscripts became known as the Byzantine family of manuscripts, and even today are the basis for what is called the majority text, or Erasmus's Textus Receptus, from which our King James Bible was later translated. The Paulician manuscripts became the basis for all Baptist groups throughout Europe during the Dark Ages up to the Protestant Reformation and Erasmus' publication of his Textus Receptus. It is to the Paulicians that we owe a debt of gratitude in being used of God to preserve His Word for us today. Had the Paulicians not faithfully preserved accurate copies of the Bible, the Waldenses after them would not have had them, and Erasmus and the Reformers would not have had them. All we would have had would have been Catholic manuscripts that were corrupted. The Paulicians are the ones God used as the human instruments to preserve His Word throughout the Middle Ages. Here now is a map. It's 60 seconds long. It shows the spread beginning over here in Armenia. If I can get it to play, we'll watch it. You'll see that they begin in the area around Armenia, and they spread into what is known as Phrygia. We've seen that with the Montanists and with the Donatists previously. From there, they were forced to move to Bulgaria by the Byzantine government. They were known as the Bogomils there. Some of them, we're told, went to southern France, Gaul, and became known as the Albigenses, or calling themselves the Cathari. Some of them joined themselves to the Waldenses in the Alps. Some Paulicians were found all the way in Germania and later became identified as Waldenses themselves. Some of them migrated from southern France to northern France, and from there they crossed the English Channel into southern England and became known as Lollards, right along with the followers of John Wycliffe in the 14th century.
Known as what?
Lollards, Lollards, spelled just like collards, but with an L at the beginning. There was a Baptist explosion in southern France. In that part of southern France where you just saw on the map that many of the Paulicians spread as missionaries during their persecutions in the Byzantine Empire, once they got to southern France, they found there many churches that had never fully integrated with the Roman Catholic Church. If we went all the way back to our history of the Donatists in the 4th century, you may remember that there were many churches in Gaul that were on the side of the Donatists and later became known as Donatists themselves because they supported the Donatists in not joining the Catholic Church. When the Paulician missionaries got to southern France, they found the remnants of those churches still in existence then, And with the missionary efforts of the Paulicians, those churches began to grow and people began to get saved. There had already existed, back to the days of Emperor Constantine, a large number of churches in southern Gaul who had refused to associate with the apostate hierarchy which became the Roman Catholic Church. But the missionary efforts of both the Donatists of North Africa and the later Paulicians from Bulgaria and Thrace had resulted in as many as half the occupants of southern France becoming Baptist by the beginning of the 12th century, that is by AD 1100. Now that's not all of southern France, but that area along the coast between, as you're looking at the map, between the Pyrenees Mountains where Spain begins and the Alps Mountains where Switzerland begins and Italy. In that area of southern France along the coast between those two mountain ranges were the Paulicians. And the churches they started became so numerous. And the people that lived there, they had so many converts that almost half the people in that part of France were known as Paulicians, or as the Catholics called them, Albigenses. Now, during this same period, there are a number of Catholic priests and monks and friars who end up getting saved because of the preaching of the Paulicians and the Albigenses. And as a result, once they're converted, they begin to preach and start Paulician churches as well. 3 of them are mentioned here. The Arnoldists, they were called that by the Catholics, not by themselves. But again, the Catholics trying to make them look like just a cult. The Catholics called them Arnoldists, followers of Arnold of Brescia, a former Italian monk who accepted Christ and renounced the evils of Catholicism until his execution in 1155. So you see, we're around the 1100s, which is the 12th century. Then there were the Petrobrucians, that's what the Catholics called them, followers or disciples of Peter de Brise, who preached against such heresies of Catholicism as veneration of crosses, infant baptism, transubstantiation, until at the last he was burned at the stake by the Catholics in AD 1131. Then there were the Henricians. The Henricians were followers of Henry of Lausanne, which is in Switzerland. He was a former Catholic monk who preached against the Roman Church until he too was imprisoned for his faith in 1148 and languished in prison until he died. Each of these former Roman Catholics were converted due to the preaching and soul winning of Paulician Anabaptists already living in those areas where they were ministering as Catholics before they were converted. And once they became Bible-believing Baptists, they became Baptist preachers, and it increased the number of people in the region that were not Catholics anymore. You can imagine that's not going to sit well with the Catholic Church. Here's a map that shows where those 3 men primarily did their preaching. The red area are the Henricians. The yellow region is the area where Peter de Brise did his preaching, and they were known as the Petrobrucians. Then the green area is the area where Arnold did his preaching, and they're known as the Arnoldists. But you can see all of those are right there around that area, from the Pyrenees Mountains on the border with Spain to the Alps Mountains on the border with Italy and Switzerland. So now we have the rise of this new group of Baptists that is so numerous, they have outnumbered the Catholics in the southern coastal area of France. Instead of calling them Paulicians at this point, because one of the 2 cities where they were the most numerous were those 2 cities on the left side of the map there, the western side, the city of Albi, A-L-B-I, and the city of Toulouse, which is southern France. the city of Albi, it was said by the Catholics, was wholly given over to these Anabaptists. And so they got a new name for these Baptists by calling them Albigenses, those from Albi. That's the Catholic name for them, but the Albigenses themselves continued to prefer the name Cathari, or the pure. As with each of the groups we've already seen, these New Testament churches in southern France were merely a continuation of the line of New Testament churches which went all the way back to the days of the apostles, in spite of attempts by the Catholic Church to make them look like just some new group that had sprung up. These Baptists were so numerous in the south of France that the Catholics argued that the entire cities down there had converted to their Anabaptist beliefs. Two of those cities were Toulouse and Albi, from whom the Catholics gave them their name, Albigenses. The name which they chose for themselves, however, was the ancient name of Cathari, meaning the pure, because of their desire to be pure in their dedication to the Scriptures. You won't read what I just told you in any secular textbook, and you won't read it in most religious history books. They will tell you, and if you Google it and you read Wikipedia or ChatGPT or any of those other things, you will see them say that the Cathari of southern France, the Albigenses of southern France, were nothing but Manichees. They were dualists. They believed in good and evil, and yes, they had some disagreements with Catholicism, but they weren't Bible-believing Christians at all. The reality is that's just a lie that has been affixed to them, like every other group of Baptists we've seen in all of Baptist history, because the Catholics want it to look like the Catholic Church is the only game out there. If you're a Christian, you're Catholic or you're nothing. You're a Catholic or you're a heretic. So, what is the origin of the Albigenses? Well, the Baptist historian Armitage says this: those of northern Italy and southern France drew to them various Oriental sects, many of them the pure men, compared with those generally seen. Prominent amongst these were Catharists from Bulgaria and Thrace. Well, who were the Catharists from Bulgaria and Thrace? They were Paulicians that had come and were endeavoring to do missionary work in southern France. And referencing the anti-Paulician historian Schmidt, here's what Schmidt says. Armitage is quoting him, but Schmidt was an anti-Paulician historian. He didn't care for them, but he admitted this: they originated in Bulgaria, from whence they spread into Thrace, where they were known as Bogomils, then into Dalmatia and Slavonia in Europe, till merchants brought the heresy to Italy, and the Crusaders brought it to France. And so Flanders, Sicily, and other countries of Europe became thoroughly infected therewith. Isn't that like a bunch of Baptists? Everywhere they go, they're taking the gospel with them and converting people. That's what their enemy is saying about them. Armitage also says this, though: the Bogomils were simply a branch of the Cathari. They were an offshoot of the Paulicians. The Paulicians of Bulgaria furnished the Cathari of southern France. So who were the Albigenses? They were Paulicians that moved to southern France and helped to plant more churches. Gibbon thinks, that's the historian on the decline of Rome, Gibbon thinks that they found their way there either by passing up the Danube River into Germany or perhaps through Venice in the channels of commerce and trade, or through the imperial garrison sent by the Greek emperor into Italy from Constantinople. But come as they might, we find them at Orleans in AD 1025, in the Netherlands in 1035, and in Turin in 1051. They are called Albigenses, but they are the Paulicians that migrated there. They're one and the same people. The Albigenses arose in southern France early in the 11th century and were first known as Publicani, but at last took their name from the city of Albi, the center of the Albigeois district. So who were the Albigenses? In reality, they were just Paulicians or Waldenses. They're all the same people. They all believe the same things. What did they believe? Well, following the usual modus operandi of the Catholic Church, they accused the Albigenses of being nothing but dualistic Manichees. And that's what you'll read in Wikipedia today. The Cathars were just Manichees, dualists. No, they weren't. To this day, history books speak of the Albigenses and Cathars as dualists. But is this the case? Armitage says this of them: they rejected the Romish Church and esteemed the New Testament above all its traditions and ceremonies. That is, they took the New Testament above the traditions and ceremonies of the Catholic Church. They did not take oaths, nor believe in baptismal regeneration, which is the belief that water baptism helps save a person, but they were ascetic and pure in their lives. That is, they just lived simple, plain lives. The historian Vignes attested to the doctrinal similarities of the Albigenses and the Waldenses, of whom we know a lot more, saying this of the Albigenses: a person from Gascony, which is on the west coast of France, worthy of confidence, affirmed to me that he had read one of their confessions written in the ancient Basque language. Now, Basque was actually part of northern Spain. These Albigenses had spilled over from France into northern Spain as they continued to plant churches. But this confession, written in the ancient Basque language, and this confession entirely agreed with the doctrine of the Valdenses or Waldenses. And in no part of it could be detected even a trace of Manichaeism. In it, they expressly declare that they received the canonical books of the Old as well as the New Testament, and that they reject every doctrine which either is not founded upon the Old and New Testament or which contains anything contrary to them. Whence, upon this principle, they profess to repudiate and condemn all the ceremonies and traditions and ordinances of the Roman Church, saying that she is a den of thieves and the harlot of the apocalypse. In other words, these were a bunch of Baptists calling the Church of Rome the harlot of the book of Revelation. Sounds a lot like your Baptist preacher, by the way. These Albigenses were Baptist. What happens when people get saved? Well, you know from your own life, but they increased so rapidly that they drove the Catholic priests from their churches, of which they took possession, forming schools and congregations of their own. Boy, that's great. That's like shutting down the bar down the road because so many people are getting saved and turning it into a church. Well, they were putting the Catholic priests out of business. Nobody was going to Mass anymore, so they ran the Catholic priest in town out of town and took over the Catholic building there and turned it into a Baptist church. As soon as the misnamed Manichaeans from Lombardy and the East make their appearance upon the stage, a totally different scene rapidly develops itself. The strangers, it is true, were a mere handful, but then they were a well-disciplined handful, accustomed to act together in concert and to move with a common object. But then their compactness and admirable fitness for missions no less appear from the concurring statement of the same writer, that along that whole line of country, that is southern France, planted here and planted there, they had 16 churches. Their local proselytes, whom they styled as believers, were absolutely innumerable. When the immigrating Paulicians first appeared in that country, the people were already predisposed to resist papal authority and were already inclined to maintain what the pontificals were pleased to call heresy. That's the Baptist historian Faber. He says that the Paulicians that moved to southern France were such soul winners and so determined in what they were doing that they worked together very soon had established 16 churches throughout southern France, and their converts were so numerous that they were running the Catholics out of business. I'd like to see us do that in Griffin, Georgia. Rome filled with rage. The Roman Church was filled with rage that the Baptists in southern France were growing so rapidly. In many of the cities and towns, Catholic priests reported that no one was even attending Mass anymore, and that there were no parishioners making confession any longer. This growth of the Albigenses spread from the Alps in Switzerland and Italy in the east to the Pyrenees Mountains bordering Spain in the west, and even into the Basque region of northern Spain. Despite thousands being burned at the stake and Bibles being confiscated and burned by the Catholics, these Baptists continued to grow in number. You see the burning at the stake of one Albigensian pastor. So what does the Catholic Church do? They did the same thing they did against the Mohammedans. They called for a crusade. Not against Muslims, but against Christians. So-called Christians calling for the death of other Christians. Of course, we know the Catholic Church isn't Christian, but they claim to be. From 1022 to 1163, the Catholic Church called a total of 8 councils against the Albigenses, in which they called for them to be imprisoned and their property confiscated. But the Albigenses were so numerous in southern France, and their numbers included so many of the local officials in all the cities and towns, that the Catholic Church couldn't get anybody to carry out the orders. In 1179, the Catholic Church called what is referred to as the Third Lateran Council to deal with this problem once and for all. It still wasn't over. In 1209, Pope Innocent III, what a name for the Pope who's about to be responsible for the murder of thousands of people, Pope Innocent III called for the Albigensian Crusade and for the extermination of the Albigensian Baptists, and he offered their lands in southern France to any loyal Catholic nobility who would act upon his orders and massacre the Baptists that were there. It was at this same time that the Catholic Church did 2 things. Number 1, they instituted the Inquisition. This is the beginning of the Inquisition. If you thought the Inquisition was to get rid of Muslims, you're wrong. If you thought it was started to get rid of Jews, you're wrong. Now, they got rid of a lot of those and killed Muslims and Jews with the Inquisition, but the Inquisition was started in the first place to kill Baptists and get rid of the Baptist problem. They also, in conjunction with starting the Inquisition, they created a new order of monks known as the Dominican order. The Dominicans were the Jesuits before there were Jesuits. They were the military arm of the Catholic Church sent by the Pope to enforce the Inquisition, round up these Baptists in southern France, find them, root them out, and execute them all. Of course, they had a willing partner in the King of France who saw an opportunity for him to gobble up all of those Albigensian lands in southern France for himself. And so he called his army up, marched them to southern France, and used the army of the King of France to kill the Baptists in southern France. The Albigensian Crusade. Some of the worst atrocities ever perpetuated against Baptists of any period happened during the Albigensian Crusades. There's no time to go through all of the atrocities. Here are 3 of the worst ones. Number 1, the sack of Béziers. It is said that in the city of Béziers, near the southern coast of France, nearly everyone in the city was an Albigensian, a Baptist. So the Catholic Church ordered the entire city to be burned down and everyone killed. The papal legate named Almeric, who led the attack against the city, described it afterward in a letter to the Pope by saying this: "Our men spared no one. irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt, as divine vengeance miraculously raged against it. No, it wasn't divine vengeance, it was Catholic vengeance. Murdered 20,000 people and burned the city to the ground. They then moved on with their Catholic army to the next major city of Albigenses, Carcassonne, and besieged the city there. The inhabitants put up a stiff resistance to the besieging army. Their wells, though, began to dry up in the heat of summer. Once they had no water within the walls of the city, it was over. Some 20,000 inhabitants asked for a treaty with the Catholic army outside the city. And the offer that was made to them was, yes, we'll let you leave without massacring you like we just did over in the city of Béziers, but you have to walk out single file, and the only thing you're allowed to take with you is your shirt and breeches. Many died of deprivation, even though they were allowed to not be massacred. They were literally marched out of the city, and they had nothing but the shirts on their back. They had no way of making a living, no way of getting food, and many of them died in the months immediately after this because of deprivation. Nowhere to live and nothing to eat. At the very end of the attack by the Catholics, years later, when they were finally in the stage of mopping up all these French Baptists, there were a few Baptists who held out in the mountaintop fortress of Montségur in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border with Spain. If you look up pictures of this mountaintop fortress, it's amazing. The mountain is steep on all sides, and the whole top of the mountain is a castle. That's why they were able to hold out for about a year up in that fortress. But alas, food and water last only so long. The Albigensian refugees fled to this mountaintop fortress in 1244 at the end of the Albigensian Crusade in a last-ditch effort to escape the army of the King of France. After holding out during a prolonged siege, the Baptists were eventually forced to surrender and marched down to the foot of the mountain, where they were forced to then watch as 200 of their pastors were pulled out of their crowd, along with a few others, and burned to death in front of them. The Catholics got rid of the pastors, primarily. So what happened to them after the crusade is over? There's that mountaintop fortress. After more than 20 years of military crusades, exterminating the Albigenses and confiscating their properties in the south of France, there was little remaining in the way of any open, organized public worship anymore in southern France. All their churches had been burned, their properties confiscated, their pastors executed. So many of the surviving Albigenses fled to the valleys of the Piedmont up in Switzerland, where the Waldensian Baptist had existed for hundreds of years, while others fled to Bohemia in Central Europe, England, and other places. But everywhere they fled, they took with them their love for the Word of God and their missionary zeal, and they flourished again. They did the same thing in the face of persecution that every Baptist group we've seen has done. They scattered because of the persecution, but everywhere they went, they took the gospel, won souls, and started churches. Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation tonight. We've gotten through the Middle Ages with the Paulicians at the beginning and the Albigenses at the end. There's one more week left in our study of Baptist history. I had wanted to include it tonight, but it would not have done justice to it. The last segment that we're going to have will, Lord willing, be next Sunday night on the Waldenses. And this study of the Waldensian Baptist is perhaps the most exciting. because in it lies the story of how the Protestant Reformation came to be. You've been told Martin Luther got saved and came to the belief in salvation by grace through faith alone by simply reading his Bible by himself. It didn't happen that way. You're told that's how John Calvin came to his own realization of salvation by grace through faith alone. It didn't happen that way. The Baptists, the Waldensian Baptists, who were the descendants of the Paulicians and the Albigenses and the Donatists before them, they are the reasons the Protestant Reformation started in the first place, because of faithfully witnessing for hundreds of years. I'm going to give you the details and the specific names, dates, and places that will prove to you that the Baptists are the reason the Protestant Reformation started when we meet next time to learn of the Waldensian Baptist. That will bring us up to the Protestant Reformation, and that's where we'll end our study on Baptist history for the time being. But it's an exciting study. I hope if you're able to, you'll be here next Sunday evening. So at this point, I'll stop, and if anyone has any questions or comments about anything we've talked about tonight, this will be the time to share those with the rest of us.